There was a time when comfort didn't come from takeout bags or microwave dinners. It came from quiet kitchens where hands moved from habit and heart. A slice of bread, a splash of milk, leftover grease from last night's fry-up, these weren't scraps. They were survival. And sometimes, they were a kind of magic. Dishes like milquetoast delight weren't made to impress. They were made when the house was cold and money was tighter than the lid on a mason jar. And yet, somehow, they brought warmth. Mock chicken cutlets offered the taste of Sunday supper on a Tuesday budget. Rice water hotcakes proved you didn't need much to start the day full. These weren't just recipes, they were solutions. Memories. Little victories made from flour, dust, and grit. No social media post ever praised sweet onion griddle cakes. No cookbook called water pie a delicacy. But families gathered around them anyway. Because the food wasn't about what it looked like. It was about what it meant. Today, these dishes sit forgotten, buried under trends, fast food chains, and changing tastes. But they're still there, in faded recipe cards, old church cookbooks, and memories that smell like warm bread and wood smoke. So let's open the pantry doors of the past and rediscover the humble genius of meals that carried generations. Milquetoast delight. Once upon a time, comfort had a different flavor. It wasn't coated in cheese or deep-fried in oil. It was soaked in warm milk, dusted with sugar, and served with the quiet dignity of survival. That's where milquetoast delight lived, somewhere between necessity and tenderness. It began with stale bread. Not because people were lazy, but because nothing was wasted. The bread, often dried from sitting out a day too long, was toasted gently on a cast iron pan, just enough to give it a little crunch, not to burn it. While that toasted bread waited patiently, milk was gently warmed on the stove. Some added a knob of butter. Others, a pinch of salt. And if there was a little sugar in the house, that turned it into a feast. The toast was laid in a shallow bowl, and warm milk was poured over it until the bread softened, not soggy, but spoonable. A sprinkle of cinnamon or nutmeg elevated it when luxury allowed. This wasn't just food. It was a ritual. A breakfast for the poor, a sickbed comfort for the unwell, and sometimes the only thing left in the house when the payday hadn't come. But to the children who grew up with it, milquetoast delight was warm safety. The kind of thing a grandmother would make when the world outside felt too sharp. Today, we scroll past such simplicity, searching for 12-ingredient smoothies or cafe-perfect French toast. But milquetoast? It asks for nothing but what's already there and gives back more than it should. It's not just a recipe. It's a memory in a bowl. And as we move forward, it reminds us, sometimes the most forgotten dishes are the ones that held us together the longest. Mock chicken cutlets. There was a time when chicken wasn't cheap. It was Sunday food, special occasion food, not something you'd casually fry on a Tuesday. But families still craved that crispy, savory bite. So they got creative. That's where mock chicken cutlets came in. They didn't start with meat. They started with leftover bread, mashed beans, or even crushed saltine crackers. Some versions used oatmeal, others relied on cooked rice or mashed potatoes. A chopped onion, a few pinches of dried herbs, and a single beaten egg were all it took to hold the illusion together. Everything was mixed until it formed a stiff dough. Then hands shaped it carefully, confidently into flat ovals, like cutlets. They were dredged in flour or more crumbs, then pan-fried in bubbling fat until golden and crisp. The first bite surprised you. Crispy outside, tender inside. Seasoned just enough to trick your taste buds. For a moment, if you closed your eyes, it might have tasted like chicken. Not because it actually did, but because someone made it with the same love and hope they'd use for a real bird. Mothers called it cutlet night without apology. Kids knew better than to ask where the meat was. These weren't meals built on expectation. They were built on resourcefulness, on knowing how to stretch what you had, and still feed a family with pride. Today, you won't find mock chicken cutlets on menus. But you might find them in the margins of an old church cookbook or scribbled on a note card with grease stains and crooked handwriting. And maybe that's where they belong, not in the spotlight, but in the quiet corners of memory. Where food was never about luxury, it was about making something out of nothing, and doing it well. Bread pudding surprise. In the kitchens of hardship, sweetness had to be earned. And few desserts carried that story better than bread pudding surprise. It wasn't made with fresh loaves or fancy custards. It was born from ends and crusts, the stale, forgotten pieces no one wanted. But somehow, what began as scraps became something treasured. Mothers and grandmothers collected old bread in tins or bags until there was enough to fill a pan. The bread was torn, never sliced, as if the act of making the pudding was half instinct, half rebellion against waste. Eggs were whisked into warm milk, sugar was added, sometimes brown, sometimes white, and on rare lucky days, molasses or a drop of vanilla. And the surprise? That changed from house to house. Sometimes it was a few raisins found at the back of the pantry. Sometimes chopped apples, or a splash of canned fruit syrup, or even a spoonful of jam swirled in right before baking. It didn't matter what it was, the surprise was simply that anything sweet could come from so little. The dish baked until golden on top, jiggly but firm underneath, with the smell of cinnamon or nutmeg filling the whole house. It came out bubbling, soft, and caramelized at the edges, served hot in winter or chilled in summer, always with a quiet sense of victory. To a child growing up in the Great Depression, it was dessert. To the cook, it was pride. Today, we think of pudding as boxed and instant. But bread pudding surprise was different. It was proof that flavor didn't need money. Just care. Just imagination. Just enough love to turn a pile of dry bread into a spoonful of something unforgettable. These aren't just recipes we've lost, they're values. Patience. Gratitude. The art of turning ordinary into extraordinary. In every brown corner and warm middle, bread pudding surprise reminds us that sometimes, the best things in life are made from what others would throw away. Canned corn chowder. It wasn't the corn that made it special. It was what people did with it. Canned corn chowder wasn't born from abundance, it was born from necessity. When fresh produce was out of season or out of reach, a can of corn became a lifeline. Sweet, shelf-stable, and endlessly versatile, it was the one ingredient almost every pantry held onto like gold. In the leaner decades, especially during the Depression and wartime rationing, this chowder became a go-to evening meal. A single can of corn would be poured into a pot along with water or evaporated milk if it was a good day. A chopped onion, a diced potato, maybe a strip or two of bacon saved from breakfast, these were the building blocks. The chowder simmered slowly. It wasn't fancy. But it was hearty. If someone had celery, it went in. If they had flour, they made a quick roux to thicken the pot. If they had nothing but corn, they made do. It filled stomachs and stretched meals. One pot could feed a family of 6, especially when paired with leftover biscuits or soda crackers crushed over the top. The steam rising from the bowl carried a smell both sweet and savory, the kind of scent that wrapped around a kitchen like a wool blanket on a cold day. And while it may sound plain now, back then, it was more than enough. It was warm. It was filling. It was comfort that cost almost nothing. What we've lost in forgetting dishes like canned corn chowder isn't just the recipe. It's the mindset. The quiet ingenuity of turning almost nothing into something worth sitting down for. Today, corn chowder might show up on modern menus with pancetta or smoked paprika. But the real magic happened when it came straight from a dented can and a determined heart. In that humble pot, families found strength and meals that didn't need much to matter. Rice water hotcakes. When flour was short and eggs were a luxury, breakfast had to be reinvented. That's when rice water hotcakes made their quiet entrance onto American tables, thin, modest, and made with the humblest of means. This was a dish born during the hardest years, when nothing could be wasted, not even the water used to boil rice. You see, when rice was cooked, the leftover starchy water wasn't poured down the drain. It was saved cloudy, thick, and warm. That liquid became the base of a batter unlike any other. Mixed with a bit of cornmeal, maybe some mashed leftover rice if there was any, and just a pinch of salt, it formed a pourable mixture that would sizzle the moment it hit a greased skillet. There were no eggs to bind it. No milk to enrich it. Just the ghost of grain and the patience of a cook who knew that a hot meal meant everything. The hotcakes came off the pan thin and flexible, somewhere between a pancake and a crepe. Golden-edged, warm, and slightly nutty in flavor, they were stacked and served with whatever could be found: apple butter, a drizzle of sorghum, maybe a spoonful of lard if times were tight. To the outside world, they were little more than fried batter. But to the families who relied on them, rice water hotcakes were survival disguised as breakfast. They filled plates without emptying cupboards. They turned scraps into something that felt complete. This dish isn't celebrated in modern cookbooks. It doesn't have a day on the calendar or a hashtag to its name. But it fed hungry mouths and warmed cold kitchens when little else could. And maybe that's the lesson it leaves behind: not every recipe has to impress. Some are meant to carry you through quiet, simple, and strong. Because when the cupboards were bare and the mornings were long, rice water hotcakes reminded families that even the water wasn't wasted, and neither was their hope. Vinegar coleslaw. Before mayonnaise filled grocery shelves and fridges hummed with cooling power, coleslaw had a sharper story, one soaked in vinegar, sugar, and survival. Vinegar coleslaw wasn't just a side dish. It was a preservation method. A cold comfort made from cabbage when refrigeration was unreliable and creamy dressings were a distant luxury. Cabbage was cheap, durable, and grew in nearly every climate. A whole head could last weeks, especially when stored in a root cellar. And during lean times, it became the star of many meals: raw, boiled, stewed, or finely shredded into a bright, crisp slaw. The dressing was simple but punchy: white vinegar, a spoonful of sugar, a pinch of salt, and sometimes a bit of mustard powder or celery seed if the pantry allowed. Heated just enough to dissolve the sugar, the dressing was poured over the raw cabbage while it was still warm. The heat softened the leaves ever so slightly, infusing every strand with a tangy bite and subtle sweetness. There were no carrots or fancy add-ins. No creamy dollops. Just honest ingredients and bold flavor. It sat well, better, in fact, the longer it rested. In fact, many families made it a day in advance. It was packed into glass jars or covered bowls, ready to be pulled out and served alongside fried potatoes, salt pork, baked beans, or cornbread. It cut through the heaviness of the meal with refreshing clarity. But vinegar coleslaw was more than contrast. It was balance. It was brightness in a season of hard work, heat, or hardship. It stayed cool without needing ice. It stayed crisp without preservatives. Today, we pile our slaws with creamy dressings and shredded kale. But the old vinegar slaw still whispers from the margins of old cookbooks, clean, honest, and unforgettable. Because sometimes, the simplest bite carries the deepest roots. And in every sharp, tangy mouthful, vinegar coleslaw reminds us, you don't need luxury to create something lasting: just vinegar, sugar, and a little bit of grit. Buttermilk pie substitute. There was a time when buttermilk wasn't sold in cartons or added to pancake mixes for fluff. It was simply what was left behind after churning butter, tart, thin, and cherished. But even that humble byproduct could run scarce. And when it did, home cooks didn't throw up their hands, they improvised. That's how buttermilk pie substitute found its way into so many wartime and Depression-era ovens. This wasn't a true buttermilk pie. It didn't need to be. It just needed to feel like one: creamy, tangy, sweet, and solid enough to slice. The substitute began with sour milk or a quick mix of vinegar and regular milk, left to curdle slightly in a warm kitchen. That became the base. From there, sugar, flour, a spoonful of lard or margarine, and an egg if available were whisked in. Lemon zest or a drop of vanilla often gave it that signature twang of brightness. It was poured into a simple hand-formed crust, sometimes made with leftover biscuit dough or crushed cracker crumbs held together with grease. Baked slowly in a wood or coal oven, it emerged golden on top, jiggly at the center, and fragrant like a memory of better days. It was sweet without being rich, tangy without being sour, and simple without being plain. This pie didn't celebrate abundance. It celebrated ingenuity. The ability to create something soft and soothing from what most would overlook or toss aside. Sliced and served plain or with a dollop of whatever topping could be spared, canned fruit syrup, sweetened cream, or nothing at all, buttermilk pie substitute wasn't a showstopper. But it was always welcome at the table. Today, we chase complex flavors and fusion fads. But in those quiet kitchens, with ration books and ration dreams, this pie substitute was enough. It didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't, just a piece of comfort, borrowed from a better recipe, shaped by necessity, and loved for exactly what it was. Sorghum cornbread. In a time when white sugar was rare and molasses too rich for the average home, there was sorghum thick, dark, and sticky as late summer dusk. Grown in southern fields and boiled down in open kettles, it became the working man's sweetener. And when added to cornbread, it turned a humble staple into something almost sacred. That's where sorghum cornbread found its place, between necessity and a touch of indulgence. Cornmeal was already the foundation of many rural meals. It was cheap, filling, and endlessly flexible. But cornbread sweetened with sorghum? That was special. The recipe varied house to house, but it often started with stone-ground cornmeal, a bit of flour if available, baking soda, and a pinch of salt. Then came the soul of the dish, a generous pour of sorghum syrup, glistening and slow, followed by buttermilk or sour milk, and maybe a beaten egg if the chickens were generous that day. Everything was mixed until thick and gritty, then poured into a sizzling cast-iron skillet greased with lard or bacon drippings. The scent that filled the kitchen was earthy, warm, and a little sweet, like toasted grain and campfire sugar. It baked until golden brown at the edges, with a firm crumb and a deep amber hue inside. Served hot, it didn't need butter, though that never hurt, and it often stood in as both bread and dessert. This was not the light, cake-like cornbread found in restaurants today. It was denser, heartier, and carried the weight of the land it came from. It paired with beans, with greens, with nothing at all, and still satisfied. Sorghum cornbread wasn't just food. It was resilience baked into wedges. Sweetness carved out of hardship. A reminder that even in the toughest seasons, there was room for flavor, for warmth, and for remembering where sweetness truly comes from. Potato salad sandwich. It sounds strange now, starch on starch, cold on soft. But once upon a time, the potato salad sandwich was a lunchtime hero in factory bags, school satchels, and farmers' pockets. It wasn't about novelty. It was about practicality, comfort, and stretching a single bowl of potato salad into an entire day's worth of nourishment. The salad itself was always made from what was on hand. Boiled potatoes, waxy and firm, never fancy. Diced onions or pickles, chopped boiled eggs if the hens had laid. A spoonful of mustard. A scrape of mayonnaise, or more likely, just vinegar, oil, and a pinch of sugar. Everything was mixed by feel, not by recipe, creamy or tangy, depending on the cook. And when there were leftovers, or when meat was out of reach for another week, that cold potato salad was spooned onto slices of white bread, sometimes layered with crisp lettuce, sometimes nothing at all. The bread soaked up the flavors, softened just enough to hold it all together without falling apart. The sandwich was wrapped in wax paper or a clean dish towel and tucked into lunch pails. By the time noon came, it was the perfect temperature, cool, comforting, and full of energy for the long hours ahead. It wasn't made to impress. It wasn't packed in shiny plastic or served with sides and sauces. But it filled stomachs and fueled bodies. For many, it tasted like home, like the fridge after Sunday supper, like Mama using every last bit so nothing went to waste. Today, we might laugh at the idea. But the potato salad sandwich was a simple solution in a world that didn't always offer choices. It was humble, yes, but never without dignity. Because in every bite was a reminder, when you make do with care, even the most unexpected combination becomes something worth remembering. Dried pea soup. Long before canned soups lined shelves and instant mixes filled pantries, there was dried pea soup, a dish as old as the hearth itself. It wasn't made to be quick. It was made to last. A pot of thick, green comfort simmered low and slow, stretching a single scoop of dried peas into hours of nourishment. Dried peas were affordable, easy to store, and packed with the kind of quiet nutrition that kept working people going. Soaking overnight was the first step, not just for softness, but for ritual. The next morning, they were added to a pot of water with chopped onions, a bay leaf if there was one, and whatever scraps were available, a ham bone from last week, a rind of bacon, or sometimes just salt and pepper. It boiled gently, thickening slowly into a hearty stew. No bright colors. No flashy ingredients. Just earth-tone honesty in every ladle. Some added carrots or celery. Others tossed in barley or leftover bits of potato to stretch it further. By the time it hit the bowl, it was thick enough to stand a spoon. Hot enough to chase the cold from your fingertips. Simple enough to serve 7 days a week, but rich enough to feel like a reward. In school lunchrooms, logging camps, immigrant kitchens, and farmhouse stoves, dried pea soup became a constant. It was what you made when you had nothing but time and a dry pantry, yet still wanted to put something warm and meaningful on the table. It wasn't just cheap food. It was dependable. It was tradition. And it tasted better the second day, especially when served with a slab of bread or cornbread on the side. Today, we've dressed it up in restaurants with creme fraiche and pancetta. But back then, dried pea soup didn't need flair. It needed only patience, salt, and the will to keep going. And in every bubbling pot, it reminded people, resilience has always had a recipe, and sometimes, it starts with a bag of dried peas. Water pie. At first glance, it sounds like a joke. Water pie. A dessert made from the one ingredient everyone had, even when they had almost nothing at all. But in the hardest years of the Great Depression, this pie was no joke. It was a small miracle of resourcefulness, and it tasted like quiet defiance against despair. The recipe was passed along not with pride, but with necessity. Start with a basic pie crust, homemade, often with lard instead of butter. Into that crust, you pour plain water. Not cream. Not milk. Just water. To that, you add a few tablespoons of sugar, a spoonful of flour to thicken it, and if you had it, a dab of butter or margarine floated right on top. That was it. No eggs. No fruit. No spice, unless a pinch of cinnamon or vanilla could be spared. Then it was placed in the oven and baked slowly until the water transformed into a soft, gelled filling somewhere between custard and syrup, sweet but not overpowering. What came out was humble but strangely elegant. A translucent, golden pie with a glossy surface and a flavor far deeper than its ingredients suggested. It wasn't rich. It wasn't luxurious. But it was dessert, real dessert, during a time when sugar itself was rationed and second servings were rare. Families sliced it thin to make it last. It became a Sunday treat, a holiday substitute, or simply the answer to the question, what can we make when we have nothing? Water pie wasn't pretending to be something else. It was exactly what it said it was, a testament to the creativity and grit of people who refused to let hardship take everything away. And maybe that's why it deserves to be remembered. Because when times got tough, folks didn't stop making dessert. They just found a way to sweeten the little they had. Sweet onion griddle cakes. In the days when store-bought meals were a fantasy and every dinner came from scratch, people learned to turn the simplest garden crops into something that stuck to the ribs. Sweet onion griddle cakes were one of those inventions, part pancake, part fritter, all flavor, and made almost entirely from pantry scraps and backyard harvests. It started with onions, usually yellow or Vidalia, freshly pulled from the garden or soft from storage. They were sliced thin or grated, sometimes soaked in salt water to mellow the bite, sometimes used raw for a punch of flavor. Then came the batter, a mix of flour, a pinch of cornmeal, salt, and enough water or milk to make it pourable. If there was an egg, it went in. If not, the onions helped bind everything together. The mixture sizzled when it hit the hot griddle, a sign that the lard or bacon grease was doing its job. Each cake fried to a deep golden brown, the edges crisp and the center soft, almost sweet. The natural sugars in the onion caramelized as they cooked, creating a flavor that danced between savory and dessert. They were served hot, sometimes stacked with butter, sometimes eaten plain right off the pan. In some homes, molasses or sorghum syrup was drizzled on top. In others, a dollop of sour cream or even applesauce made its way to the plate. Sweet onion griddle cakes weren't glamorous, but they were filling, warm, and shockingly delicious, proof that good cooking didn't need riches, just know-how and a hot skillet. These cakes were often made during lean months, when meat was scarce and onions were the only things still growing. Yet they didn't feel like a compromise. They felt like a treat. Today, they've nearly vanished, replaced by boxed mixes and frozen waffles. But those old cakes, made with onions and heart, still whisper from cast-iron pans of the past. Because in every crisp, golden bite, they remind us, flavor doesn't come from price, it comes from patience, fire, and one honest ingredient. Flaky water biscuits. They didn't rise with grandeur or smell like butter. They weren't layered with cream or filled with herbs. But flaky water biscuits were the kind of bread that showed up when there was nothing else left to bake, and somehow, they never felt like less. These weren't your fluffy southern biscuits. They were lean, stripped to the essentials: flour, water, salt, and just a bit of lard or fat if any could be spared. They came from wartime ration books, depression kitchens, and the minds of resourceful cooks who knew that a little could go a long way. The dough was mixed by hand until it just came together, no eggs, no dairy, just instinct. Rolled thin, folded once or twice, then rolled again, they were cut into simple rounds or squares and baked hot until they puffed just enough. What they lacked in richness, they made up for in texture, crisp on the outside, tender in the middle, and layered with the faint flake of a careful hand. These biscuits didn't pretend to be fancy. But paired with jam, dipped in gravy, or served alongside soup, they became something far more than the sum of their parts. For families struggling to stretch one meal into the next, a pan of water biscuits was a saving grace. And yet, they weren't sad food. They were clever food. Survival food. The kind of staple that didn't need a recipe card, just memory, practice, and a hot oven. In army mess halls, prairie cabins, and city apartments alike, flaky water biscuits proved that even during the hardest times, people still needed bread. Not for luxury, but for comfort, routine, and something to hold the rest of the meal together. Today, they've nearly disappeared. But the story they tell is still baked into every crisp bite. When the cupboard is bare and hope feels thin, all you need is flour, water, and a reason to keep going. Cucumber tea sandwiches. Long before fast food and factory lunches, there was an elegance to the everyday, even in the simplest things. Cucumber tea sandwiches weren't about indulgence. They were about slowing down. About savoring the lightness of a moment, even when the world outside felt heavy. These dainty sandwiches first made their way across the Atlantic with English influence, but they found a home in American kitchens, especially in church socials, garden luncheons, and afternoon porch visits where women gathered with fans and folded napkins. In the South, they became a quiet tradition, chilled, crisp, and refreshingly humble. The bread was plain white sandwich bread, unsweetened and sliced thin. Crusts were trimmed with care, not to waste, but to elevate. The cucumbers? Thinly sliced, almost translucent. Sometimes salted lightly and left to drain on a towel to avoid sogginess. Sometimes brushed with vinegar or lemon juice for a bit of tang. A layer of softened butter, often with a pinch of salt or herbs mixed in, coated the bread. Mayonnaise was used in some households, cream cheese in others. The cucumbers were layered evenly, then topped and pressed gently before slicing into neat fingers or triangles. They weren't made to fill you up. They were made to refresh, to accompany quiet conversation or a glass of iced tea with mint. And on a hot summer day, there was nothing more cooling than biting into chilled bread and crisp cucumber. During the Depression, they may have seemed too delicate for such hard times, but they endured. Why? Because they didn't require much. A loaf of bread. One cucumber. A bit of spread. And suddenly, you had a plate of something that felt soft, civilized, and utterly peaceful. Cucumber tea sandwiches reminded people that even when life was rough, a little gentleness could still be made and shared. Because sometimes, survival isn't about what's heavy. Sometimes, it's about what stays light, cool, and quietly beautiful. We often think of history as something written in books, in wars, inventions, and grand declarations. But some of the most honest stories are told in flour, milk, and old cast-iron pans. In food that wasn't photographed or plated with flair, but made quietly, over and over again, because it had to be. These 15 forgotten dishes weren't just meals. They were lifelines. Water pie, rice water hotcakes, flaky water biscuits, they carried families through nights of worry and mornings of empty wallets. They were the result of innovation, of mothers and grandmothers who measured hope by the spoonful, and made something from almost nothing. And while their names might sound strange today, even laughable to some, there's nothing funny about feeding your family with what little you have. That takes courage. That takes heart. That takes a kind of genius we don't often talk about. These recipes weren't about perfection. They were about presence. About showing up in the kitchen, day after day, with tired hands and a stubborn spirit. They deserve to be remembered not because they were trendy, but because they were true. So maybe it's time we dust off those old cookbooks. Revisit the pages written in grease stains and pencil marks. Try a pie that starts with water. Or a sandwich made from potato salad. Not because we have to, but because we want to understand how far we've come, and what we've left behind. Because buried in every forgotten dish is a reminder, food isn't just about flavor. It's about survival. It's about love. It's about making something last when there's nothing left to give. And if that's not worth remembering, what is?